Griselda Blanco's name is one that echoes with fear, fascination, and dark reverence. Often referred to as the cocaine queen of Miami, her story remains one of the most captivating and chilling tales of power, violence, and the criminal underworld.
985.
But what made her reign so
96.
terrifying?
987.
Was it her ruthless ambition, her cold
98.
disregard for human life,
Keep your
or
eyes
the
on that
eerie
alley.
calm with which she orchestrated one of the most
Police, show your
significant drug
hands.
empires in history? As the sun set over the glittering beaches of Miami in the late 1970s, a storm was brewing in the shadows, a storm that would change the city forever. This is the story of Griselda Blanco, the woman who ruled with fear and left an indelible mark on the drug trade, and whose name became synonymous with violence, power, and the price of survival. In the early days, Miami was a city of contrasts. The sparkling ocean, the white sands, the nightlife, and the endless sunshine were part of the allure that drew thousands to the city. Yet beneath this glitzy veneer, Miami was home to a darker reality. The cocaine trade was flourishing, and drug lords were rising to power like kings of a new empire. In the heart of this empire was Griselda Blanco, a woman who would go on to become a criminal mastermind, feared and respected by all who crossed her path. It was in the seedy underworld of the city's streets that Griselda Blanco's name began to take root. Born in Colombia in the 1940s, Blanco was no stranger to hardship. Her early years were marked by poverty and violence. Growing up in the slums, she learned early on that survival often came at a high cost. From a young age, she exhibited a fierce determination and an unyielding desire to rise above her circumstances. These traits would eventually propel her into the world of crime. But before she became the queen of Miami's cocaine empire, Blanco was just another young girl trying to make her way in a dangerous world. Little did anyone know, her journey would lead her down a path that would ultimately redefine the drug trade itself. Her move to the United States in the late 1970s marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one that would see her gradually transition from a small-time hustler to the most feared woman in the world of drugs. Blanco's early life in the United States was filled with hardship, but it also provided her with the perfect backdrop to build her empire. She quickly established herself as a fierce and determined businesswoman, ready to do whatever it took to succeed. It wasn't long before she made her first important connections with key figures in the Colombian cartels, and soon, Blanco was controlling the flow of cocaine into Miami, an operation so lucrative it would come to rival some of the most powerful criminal enterprises in history. As her empire grew, so did her reputation. Blanco wasn't just a figurehead, she was a ruthless strategist who used violence and intimidation to control her empire. Her rise to power was swift and brutal, and it didn't take long for her to become known as the cocaine queen of Miami. But what was it that made her so feared? Was it her ability to make quick, decisive moves in the cutthroat world of drug trafficking, or was it the sheer terror she instilled in those around her? Blanco was a woman who demanded respect, and she was willing to use extreme measures to get it. It was during the height of her reign that the true nature of her power began to surface. Blanco's control over the cocaine trade was absolute. She had the entire supply chain in her hands, from the Colombian cartels to the street dealers in Miami. She was the one who decided who lived and who died, and she made sure that anyone who betrayed her paid the ultimate price. Blanco's empire was built on a foundation of fear, and she ruled with an iron fist. But her power wasn't just derived from her ability to kill, it was also the way she used her mind to stay several steps ahead of her enemies. She was a master manipulator, always thinking 2 or 3 moves ahead of everyone else, and always ready to strike when the time was right. But with power came paranoia. As Blanco's empire expanded, so did the risks. She knew that one wrong move could bring everything crashing down. The weight of her empire, the fear of betrayal, and the constant threat of law enforcement were always in the back of her mind. She had built her kingdom on violence, but it was this very violence that would eventually lead to her downfall. Griselda Blanco wasn't just fighting to stay on top of the drug trade, she was fighting to protect herself from the very people she had once trusted. The paranoia that consumed her was palpable, and it drove her to take increasingly dangerous risks, further isolating her from those around her. Yet, in many ways, her paranoia was justified. The world of organized crime is full of betrayal, and Griselda Blanco was no exception to this rule. Those who once served her loyally began to turn on her, and the cracks in her empire began to show. Blanco's unrelenting drive for power and control made her enemies out of former allies, and soon, even the people closest to her were plotting behind her back. In the end, it wasn't just law enforcement that brought her down, it was the very people she had once trusted with her empire. Despite the growing danger, Blanco remained unyielding. Her story is a testament to her resilience, but also to her unrelenting need for dominance. She was a woman who refused to be controlled, and in doing so, she created an empire that was both legendary and terrifying. But as the law closed in on her, Blanco's once thriving empire began to crumble. The very people she had used to rise to power were now the ones who were responsible for her fall. Her empire, built on fear, violence, and manipulation, was in ruins. The woman who had once ruled Miami with an iron fist was now facing the consequences of her actions. As Blanco's downfall began, her name became synonymous with more than just the cocaine trade. She became a symbol of the destructive power of unchecked ambition, of a woman who had risen to the top of the criminal world but was ultimately consumed by her own paranoia. The tale of her rise and fall serves as a cautionary tale for those who seek power at any cost. It is a reminder that even the most powerful empires can fall, and that the price of domination is often too high to pay. Griselda Blanco's life and legacy remain a subject of fascination. Her story is one of survival, of ambition, and of the dark side of the American dream. In many ways, she was a product of her environment, a woman shaped by the streets and the violence that surrounded her. Yet, she was also a force of nature, a woman who defied the odds and built an empire in a world that was not kind to women. Blanco's story is one that continues to captivate the imagination, a story of power, violence, and the ultimate cost of ambition. As her reign over Miami came to an end, the shadow of her influence lingered, casting a long, dark mark on the history of the city and the drug trade. Griselda Blanco's early life in Colombia is a tale marked by poverty, hardship, and survival. Born in the late 1940s, she came into the world amidst the shadows of violence that plagued the streets of her hometown. The daughter of a young, struggling mother and an absent father, Blanco's childhood was shaped by a series of misfortunes that forced her to grow up far too quickly. Her mother, unable to care for her, left her in the care of relatives for much of her early years. These formative experiences would play a key role in shaping the woman who would one day become one of the most feared figures in the world of organized crime. Her environment was one of desperation. The poverty-stricken neighborhoods where she grew up were filled with violence and crime. The constant threat of danger loomed large in her world, and survival often depended on ruthlessness. Blanco was a product of her surroundings, her spirit hardened by the difficult conditions she faced. From a young age, she learned to rely on her wits and her ability to manipulate those around her. By the time she was a teenager, she had already begun to walk the fine line between victim and perpetrator, using her quick thinking and fearlessness to navigate the dangerous world around her. In her early teens, Blanco's path to the criminal underworld took shape. The streets of her neighborhood were rife with opportunities for someone like her, someone who wasn't afraid to take risks. She became involved in petty theft, pickpocketing, and small-scale hustling, learning the skills she would later use to rise to power. Blanco's natural charisma and ability to charm her way into situations quickly gained her the attention of more dangerous individuals. By the time she was in her mid-teens, she was already working for the local crime syndicates, helping to orchestrate small-scale robberies and crimes. This was only the beginning of a much darker journey. Blanco's early experiences in crime were just the first steps in her eventual rise to power. However, it was during her teenage years that she became involved with men who would guide her deeper into the world of organized crime. These men saw something in her, a spark, an ambition, a willingness to do what was necessary to succeed. They took her under their wing, teaching her the ins and outs of the drug trade, and it wasn't long before Blanco learned the importance of connections, secrecy, and violence. The fearlessness she had shown as a young girl now became her weapon of choice. At just 19, Griselda Blanco left Colombia for the United States, a decision that would prove to be the turning point in her life. She was seeking something more, something that could elevate her beyond the hardships she had endured. But even in the United States, Blanco carried with her the lessons of the streets, the survival instincts, the ability to read people, and, perhaps most importantly, the relentless drive to build an empire. She knew that the world of crime in Miami was filled with opportunity, and she was determined to make her mark. Arriving in Miami in the early 1970s, Blanco quickly realized that the city was ripe for the taking. Miami, known for its sunny beaches and thriving tourism, was also a growing hub for the drug trade. The influx of cocaine from Colombia created a perfect storm of opportunity for someone with Blanco's ambition. She saw the cracks in the system, the weaknesses in the existing criminal organizations, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before she could exploit them. The city's bustling streets and vibrant nightlife became the perfect cover for the illicit activities that would soon flow through its veins. It was not long before Blanco made her first connections in the world of drug trafficking. Her ability to move through different social circles and make deals with both local criminals and Colombian cartels made her an invaluable asset. Blanco's rise was swift. Within just a few years, she had established herself as a key player in the cocaine trade, securing access to powerful cartels back in Colombia and controlling a steady flow of cocaine into the United States. She didn't just want a piece of the pie, she wanted to control it all. Blanco's methods were as calculated as they were brutal. Unlike many of her male counterparts, she had a keen understanding of how to operate with precision. She knew how to strike fear into the hearts of those who might betray her, and she wasn't afraid to use violence to make sure people stayed in line. Blanco's ability to maintain control over her territory was unmatched, and she quickly gained a reputation for being a ruthless leader, willing to do whatever it took to maintain her grip on the cocaine trade. However, it wasn't just violence that made Blanco a force to be reckoned with. It was also her intelligence, her ability to see the bigger picture, and her understanding of the intricate networks that kept the drug trade flowing smoothly. She was a master strategist, constantly thinking ahead, always considering the next move. She knew how to avoid the law, how to keep her hands clean while still pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Her ability to outsmart her enemies, to stay one step ahead of the law, made her nearly untouchable in the world of crime. But even as Blanco's empire grew, so did the threats against it. Her rise to power was marked by constant tension with rival drug lords, with law enforcement, and even within her own organization. Blanco's paranoia began to take hold. She trusted no one, not even her closest allies, and she built a network of informants and spies to keep her aware of any potential threats. The very fear that she had used to build her empire soon began to consume her. The people around her began to sense her paranoia, and the cracks in her organization began to show. Despite the growing tensions, Blanco continued to expand her influence. Her empire stretched across the United States, from Miami to New York, and even into Europe. Her reach was global, and her operations were both sophisticated and efficient. She controlled everything from the smuggling routes to the distribution networks. Blanco had successfully turned the cocaine trade into a highly profitable, well-oiled machine. But with such power came the inevitability of conflict. Her enemies were growing stronger, and the pressure was mounting from all sides. Her rise had been swift, but it was also fraught with peril. Blanco's ambition and ruthlessness had brought her to the top of the criminal world, but they also left her isolated and paranoid. In the midst of her success, Blanco began to question who she could trust. The very alliances that had helped her succeed now seemed to be the source of her greatest threats. The world she had so carefully constructed began to unravel, piece by piece. It was during this period of mounting tension that Blanco made her most fateful decisions that would lead to her eventual downfall. Her empire, once built on fear and control, now faced internal strife. Blanco was no longer just fighting against rival drug lords or law enforcement, she was fighting against the very people who had helped her build her empire. Her paranoia had reached its peak, and her ability to trust anyone was virtually non-existent. The road ahead would not be easy for Blanco. As her power continued to grow, so did the dangers surrounding her. But despite the threats, Griselda Blanco remained resolute. She had come too far to let anyone take her down. Yet, as history would show, even the most powerful empires can fall, and no amount of power or paranoia could protect her from the inevitable consequences of her actions. The tale of Griselda Blanco is not just one of crime and power, it is also a story of survival, of ambition, and of the relentless pursuit of a dream, no matter the cost. Griselda Blanco's entry into the drug trade was nothing short of calculated. She arrived in Miami in the early 1970s, bringing with her not just the memories of a harsh upbringing but the burning ambition to carve out a piece of the American dream, though for her, that dream would be built on a foundation of crime, deceit, and ruthless efficiency. Unlike many who might have come to the United States seeking a fresh start, Blanco had no intention of starting over in the conventional sense. She saw a city ripe for the taking, a sprawling metropolis with its beautiful beaches and tourist-filled streets, yet underneath it all was an underworld full of promise. Miami was, at the time, a city being torn apart by corruption, with both the police and the criminals growing ever more emboldened. The streets were filled with opportunity, if you had the nerve and the wit to seize it. Blanco didn't waste time finding her place in this world. Within months of settling in Miami, she had begun to establish herself among the city's growing drug-running scene. Her connections with Colombia's notorious Medellin cartel, known for its vast cocaine empire, were quickly solidified, allowing her to start small yet lucrative drug shipments across the U.S. Her rise wasn't marked by any grand gestures or public displays of power, it was much subtler, more insidious. She began by operating on the fringes of Miami's nightlife, striking deals with street-level dealers and getting a taste of the cocaine trade that was still in its infancy in the U.S. But her ambition was far grander than small-time dealings. The cocaine business, though not yet the enormous empire it would soon become, was gaining momentum in Miami. The city was becoming the primary entry point for South American cocaine, and the demand for the drug was growing exponentially, especially among the wealthy and the influential. Blanco recognized this as an opportunity and wasted no time making the right connections. She wasn't like many of the other criminals she encountered, where others relied on brute force and intimidation. Blanco used a different kind of strategy, intelligence, charm, and an unwavering focus on the end goal. She had a mind for business, for logistics, for organization, and soon, she started to build a network that could rival the most established drug cartels. In the beginning, she was just another player, another dealer among many, but that wouldn't last long. What set Blanco apart from many others in the business was her ability to see the big picture. While other smugglers and drug dealers were content to move small quantities of cocaine into the country and resell it in Miami, Blanco saw the potential for a much larger operation. She understood that if she could establish a steady supply route directly from Colombia, bypassing the competition, she could control the flow of cocaine into Miami and, ultimately, to the rest of the United States. Blanco was methodical, and her sharp business acumen allowed her to create a system that could handle large shipments of cocaine, millions of dollars worth. But as with any empire, her rise to power wasn't without risk. Her first major step toward dominance came when she partnered with Pablo Escobar and other figures in the Medellin cartel. Blanco, with her charm and fierce determination, quickly became a trusted figure in their network. As a woman in a male-dominated industry, she faced skepticism and doubt, but she quickly proved herself to be more than capable. She was not intimidated by the men around her and soon made a name for herself as one of the top traffickers in the cocaine trade. With her cartel connections solidified, Blanco became the queen of cocaine in Miami, securing her place as one of the most influential figures in the entire drug trade. By the mid-1970s, Griselda Blanco had built an empire. She wasn't simply another small-time dealer, she was the mastermind behind a vast smuggling operation that stretched from Colombia all the way to Miami, with an intricate web of distributors and dealers working under her. The cocaine flowed steadily into the United States, flooding Miami with product that was being sold for astronomical prices. Blanco was not just selling cocaine, she was orchestrating an entire network. She controlled everything, from the production of the drug to its distribution, its transportation, and the street-level sales. Her empire was as efficient as it was violent, and she used fear and intimidation to maintain her dominance. Blanco's rise to power didn't come without its share of obstacles. Rival drug lords, police, and even members of her own network sought to dethrone her. But where others might have crumbled, Blanco became more resolute. She wasn't afraid to make enemies, and she wasn't afraid to use violence to protect her empire. She had a reputation for ruthlessness, and that reputation was key to her success. She wasn't just a businesswoman, she was a woman willing to kill to protect what she had built. Blanco became infamous for her brutal tactics, and stories of her violent methods spread like wildfire. Those who betrayed her or crossed her would often meet their end in a brutal and public way. The message was clear: betrayal would not be tolerated. But while Blanco's methods were violent, her intelligence was what truly set her apart. She understood the drug trade like no one else. She knew how to evade law enforcement, how to keep the authorities at bay while continuing her operations. She had a network of informants, a well-oiled system of bribery, and, perhaps most importantly, she knew how to lay low when needed. She was always thinking 2 steps ahead, always calculating the risks and rewards of each move. Blanco knew that in the world she inhabited, success depended not just on the money but on the ability to outthink, outsmart, and outlast your competitors. Her operation grew exponentially. Blanco was soon bringing in tons of cocaine each month, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She controlled the flow of cocaine into the United States, and she began to expand her empire beyond Miami. The profits were staggering, and Blanco became one of the richest women in the world. But her wealth and power didn't come without consequences. The bigger her operation grew, the more people she had to control. And the more people she controlled, the more enemies she made. Rival cartels were constantly trying to push her out of the picture, and law enforcement was beginning to take notice. Yet Blanco remained untouchable. For a time, it seemed as though nothing could stand in her way. She was a queen in a world dominated by men, and her reputation was that of someone who could not be defeated. But even the most invincible empires have their cracks. Blanco's paranoia began to set in. The more power she accumulated, the more fearful she became of losing it. She started to see betrayal where there was none, and her once loyal allies became her biggest threats. Blanco's ability to trust anyone, even her closest associates, began to erode. The fear that had once made her empire strong now began to consume her from the inside. The downfall of Blanco's empire began with a shift in the way she operated. As her paranoia grew, so did the number of enemies. Old friends turned into enemies, and Blanco's increasing isolation made it harder for her to maintain control. Her empire was on the brink of collapse, and the once untouchable queen of cocaine was now fighting to survive in a world that had turned against her. Even though her empire was still vast, the cracks in the foundation had begun to show. Blanco's story was one of rise and fall, of a woman who built a criminal empire from nothing, only to see it slip through her fingers due to the very traits that had helped her rise to power. She had outsmarted the authorities, outmaneuvered rivals, but in the end, it would be her own fears and suspicions that led to her undoing. As Griselda Blanco's empire teetered on the edge, the once proud queen of cocaine began to face the consequences of her actions. The drugs, the violence, the betrayals, it all caught up with her. Her empire crumbled, and the woman who had ruled over Miami with an iron fist was now at the mercy of her enemies, the law, and her own fractured mind. Blanco's rise was meteoric, but her fall was inevitable. The empire she had built would soon be nothing more than a shadow of its former self, and the woman who had once commanded the streets of Miami would be left to pick up the pieces of a life that had spiraled beyond her control. Griselda Blanco's transition from a small-time hustler to the queenpin of the Miami drug trade was swift and marked by her ability to recognize opportunities where others saw only obstacles. With a mind that was sharp as a blade and a heart hardened by years of struggle, she wasted no time building her empire. It was a calculated move, a chess game where every pawn was expendable, but every piece played its part in the larger strategy. Blanco didn't just want to be a part of the cocaine trade, she wanted to dominate it. The city of Miami, with its expansive beaches, glittering nightlife, and increasing tourist traffic, provided the perfect backdrop for her ambition. While many came to the city for its promise of sunshine and relaxation, Blanco saw only potential for profit, a city on the edge of becoming the heart of America's cocaine boom. In the mid-1970s, Miami was still in the early stages of becoming the epicenter of the cocaine trade. The city had always been a transitory point, a place where the drug-running routes between South America and the United States converged, but now, with the rising popularity of cocaine, the stakes were higher. Dealers, smugglers, and criminals were flooding the streets, and competition was fierce. Blanco, however, had an edge. She wasn't just another street dealer, she had a vision for something much bigger. She saw the future of the cocaine business, and she wasn't about to let anyone else control it. Unlike many of the other dealers at the time who were content with small shipments or local distribution, Blanco's aspirations stretched far beyond the streets of Miami. She wanted to build a network that spanned continents, a supply chain that would supply millions of dollars worth of cocaine to the United States, and she knew exactly how to make it happen. Griselda Blanco's connections to Colombia's Medellin cartel were crucial in her rise to power. The cartel, with its vast network of suppliers and producers, was in the perfect position to provide the quantities of cocaine Blanco needed to fuel her empire. Blanco, ever the astute strategist, made sure to solidify her position within the cartel's operations. Through her alliances, she was able to secure the supply lines that would become the backbone of her cocaine empire. The shipment of cocaine from Colombia to the United States was a well-coordinated operation, and Blanco became an integral part of this complex web. By securing these crucial ties to the cartel, she positioned herself at the top of an increasingly profitable market. But her connections weren't just limited to the cartel. Blanco's ability to navigate the underworld and form partnerships with local dealers, street-level suppliers, and even law enforcement was what really set her apart. She understood the importance of building relationships, of maintaining a network of informants and allies who could help her keep her empire running smoothly. Blanco didn't trust many people, but she knew that the key to controlling such a vast operation was to ensure that no one could take it down from the inside. She kept a tight grip on her empire, using both fear and loyalty to keep everyone in line. Betrayal was met with brutal consequences, and those who dared to cross her often met violent ends. As her cocaine empire began to take shape, Blanco's influence grew rapidly. The money started to pour in, and with it, the power. She wasn't just another criminal trying to make a name for herself, she had become a force to be reckoned with. Her operation stretched far beyond the streets of Miami, reaching into New York, California, and beyond. Blanco's business acumen and her ability to manage logistics made her one of the most efficient traffickers in the world. She controlled everything, from the cultivation and production of cocaine in Colombia to its distribution on American streets. Her empire was like a well-oiled machine, each part functioning in harmony to produce massive profits. The amount of cocaine that was being smuggled into the United States was staggering, and Blanco was at the helm of it all. Despite her growing power and wealth, Blanco's empire was not without its challenges. The cocaine trade, by its very nature, was dangerous, and Blanco's operations were constantly at risk of being disrupted. Rival drug lords sought to take over her territory, and law enforcement agencies began to take notice of the staggering amounts of cocaine that were flooding into the United States. Blanco, however, was no ordinary criminal. Her ability to stay one step ahead of the authorities was remarkable. She employed a network of informants and bribe-paying allies to keep law enforcement off her trail. She knew the importance of keeping a low profile, and she went to great lengths to avoid detection. Blanco had a knack for creating a network of silence, making sure that those around her didn't talk, didn't ask questions, and, above all, didn't get caught. Her empire was growing, and with it, her reputation for ruthlessness. Blanco's ability to command respect was unmatched. She was known for her cold, calculating demeanor and her willingness to use violence to get what she wanted. Unlike many male drug lords, Blanco didn't rely on brute force alone, though she was more than capable of wielding it when necessary. Instead, she used fear as a tool. She made it clear that anyone who crossed her would suffer the consequences. Her reputation spread far beyond Miami, and soon, the very mention of her name struck terror into the hearts of those in the drug trade. As the 1980s approached, Blanco's empire reached its peak. The cocaine flowed freely into Miami, where it was distributed across the country. Blanco had become one of the most powerful figures in the American drug trade, her name synonymous with the brutal realities of the cocaine business. Her ability to maintain control over such a vast and complex operation was a testament to her cunning and her unyielding determination. But as her empire grew, so did the dangers that came with it. Rival cartels, law enforcement, and even members of her own organization began to pose threats to Blanco's reign. The cracks in her empire began to show, and the paranoia that had long simmered beneath the surface began to take hold. Blanco was no longer just fighting to stay on top, she was fighting to survive. It was during this period of tension that Blanco's methods began to shift. Her paranoia grew, and she became increasingly distrustful of those around her. The once tight network of allies she had built began to unravel as she began to suspect that even her most loyal associates might be betraying her. Blanco, who had once been able to keep her empire running smoothly through loyalty and fear, now found herself isolated and vulnerable. Her increasingly erratic behavior alienated many of her allies, and soon, she found herself surrounded by enemies on all sides. Despite the growing threats, Blanco remained fiercely determined to protect her empire. She turned to increasingly violent tactics to maintain control, using brutality to quell any signs of rebellion within her organization. The drug trade, by its nature, had always been a violent business, but Blanco's methods were often considered to be beyond the pale. She used murder, intimidation, and fear to keep her position secure, and it worked, at least for a while. But even Blanco, with all her power and cunning, could not outrun the inevitable consequences of her actions. As her empire continued to expand, so did the risks. The law began to close in on her, and Blanco's reign over the Miami drug trade was starting to show signs of crumbling. Her paranoia, once an asset, had become her greatest enemy. The empire she had so carefully built began to falter, and the once feared queen of cocaine found herself fighting not just for survival in the streets but for her own sanity. The next chapter of her life would be one of immense change, as Blanco would have to face the consequences of her actions, consequences that would ultimately lead to the downfall of her empire. Griselda Blanco's downfall was inevitable, though it came with an eerie sense of finality that no amount of power or wealth could stave off. The empire she had built over nearly a decade, one founded on ruthless efficiency, intimidation, and violence, was beginning to crack under the weight of her own paranoia. Once the queen of Miami's drug trade, Blanco found herself increasingly isolated, surrounded by enemies who had once been her allies and those who sought to dismantle the empire she had so carefully constructed. The very things that had made her successful, her cunning, her ruthless efficiency, and her unflinching drive, were now the forces that would ultimately lead to her downfall. Paranoia took hold of Blanco, turning her into a shell of the confident, calculating figure she had once been. Every move she made was weighed down by the fear of betrayal, the constant belief that someone within her inner circle was plotting against her. Her empire, which once ran like a machine, had become a source of constant stress and anxiety. Blanco's violent tactics, once effective in securing her control, now seemed to be backfiring. The ruthless manner in which she dealt with rivals and betrayers had created a trail of blood and broken alliances. The very network of loyalty she had built through fear and intimidation was now fraying at the edges. Her paranoia drove her to distrust even her closest associates, and soon, Blanco found herself without the reliable allies she had once relied upon. She had become a woman trapped in her own empire, a queen with no kingdom left to rule, no loyal soldiers to carry out her orders. The very thing that had propelled her to the top of the drug trade, her iron grip on power, was now her prison. As her empire began to unravel, Blanco's personal life started to crumble as well. She was no longer the same woman who had arrived in Miami in the early 1970s, full of ambition and confidence. The years of drug running, the constant threat of violence, and the weight of maintaining such a vast operation had taken their toll on her. Her relationships with her family and associates grew increasingly strained, and she became more isolated than ever. The very people she had trusted to help her build her empire were now the ones who were turning on her, and Blanco could feel the walls closing in. She was a woman who had risen to the top of a criminal underworld, only to find that her power was fleeting and fragile. The same people she had once feared were now the ones she feared the most. In the early 1980s, law enforcement began to close in on her. Blanco's reign was finally being challenged by the very authorities she had managed to avoid for so long. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and other federal agencies had begun to piece together the full scope of Blanco's operation. Her empire, built on smuggling millions of dollars worth of cocaine into the United States, had not gone unnoticed. Blanco had been able to avoid arrest for years, but the pressure was mounting, and the law was finally catching up to her. The once unfathomable empire she had built was now being dismantled piece by law enforcement officers who had been investigating her for years. Blanco's paranoia, her need to control every aspect of her operation, and her growing isolation made her increasingly vulnerable to the very thing she had spent so many years avoiding: capture. Yet Blanco did not go down without a fight. Even as law enforcement closed in, she managed to stay one step ahead for a time. Her network of informants, her careful attention to detail, and her ability to remain elusive kept her from being captured immediately. But even she couldn't outrun the inevitable. As the authorities tightened the noose around her neck, Blanco's empire began to crumble. The cartel's powerful figures, once loyal to her, began to distance themselves, and even those who had once worked for her started to turn against her. The underworld she had once ruled with such efficiency had now become a place where betrayal and distrust ran rampant. Blanco was losing control, not only of her drug empire but of her own fate. In 1985, Griselda Blanco was finally arrested. The charges against her were numerous, including drug trafficking, murder, and racketeering. She had been at the center of one of the largest cocaine smuggling operations in history, responsible for bringing tons of cocaine into the United States. The amount of cocaine she had distributed was staggering, and her role in the Medellin cartel had made her one of the most powerful women in the world of organized crime. Blanco's arrest marked the end of an era, the downfall of the cocaine queen of Miami, a woman who had ruled the drug trade with an iron fist. The trial that followed was a spectacle in its own right. Blanco, once untouchable, was now facing the full force of the U.S. legal system. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the government was determined to ensure that she would never again be able to control the drug trade. Blanco was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for her role in the cocaine operation, though the legal battles did not end there. Her trial became a symbol of the government's increasing efforts to dismantle the powerful cartels that were flooding the country with cocaine. Blanco's arrest and conviction were seen as a victory for law enforcement, but for Blanco herself, it was the beginning of a long and grueling fight for survival. While Blanco spent years in prison, the world outside her cell continued to change. The drug trade, particularly the cocaine business, continued to evolve. Her former allies, such as Pablo Escobar, had either been killed or captured, and the drug cartels that once relied on her had fractured. Blanco, despite her fall from grace, remained a figure of infamy in the criminal world. She was a woman who had once ruled an empire, and her name still carried weight. Even behind bars, she was still feared by many, and her reputation continued to precede her. The cocaine queen may have been locked away, but her legacy was far from over. In 2004, after serving nearly 2 decades in prison, Griselda Blanco was released. Her health had deteriorated during her time behind bars, but she was still very much alive, a symbol of the cocaine trade's heyday. However, by the time she was released, Blanco's power had waned. The world she had once ruled with such fear and precision had long since changed. The cocaine business was no longer the empire it once was, and Blanco was no longer the queen-pin she had been. Her release did not restore her to the heights of power she had once enjoyed. She was no longer a feared figure in Miami or the drug world. The cocaine queen was a relic of a bygone era, a woman whose empire had crumbled under the weight of her own ambition and the unstoppable forces of law enforcement. Blanco spent the last years of her life in relative obscurity. She lived quietly in California, a far cry from the life of power and violence that had defined her for so many years. Though she was no longer involved in the drug trade, her name continued to be associated with the cocaine boom of the 1980s. Blanco, who had once been untouchable, was now a shadow of her former self, living in seclusion and dealing with the consequences of her past. In 2012, Griselda Blanco was killed in a drive-by shooting in her adopted hometown of Medellín, Colombia. Her death, while tragic, was also fitting in a way. Blanco had lived and died by the violence that had defined her life. Her death marked the end of an era, a final chapter in the story of a woman who had once been at the center of one of the most powerful criminal empires in the world. Blanco's legacy, however, endures. Her story is a cautionary tale of the destructive nature of unchecked ambition and the lengths one can go to in order to secure power. Griselda Blanco rose to the top of the criminal world by playing the game with brutal precision, but in the end, it was the very nature of that game, the violence, the betrayal, and the paranoia, that led to her fall. Her empire was built on blood, and it ultimately crumbled in much the same way. The cocaine queen of Miami may have faded from the spotlight, but her legacy remains an indelible part of the history of the drug trade. Griselda Blanco's life, though marked by incredible highs, was ultimately defined by the tremendous fall from grace that came after her reign as the queen of the cocaine trade. In many ways, her story encapsulated the very essence of what it meant to rise to unimaginable heights only to watch it all crumble away. The empire she had built through sheer willpower and ruthless cunning had earned her both admiration and fear. She was a woman who had managed to carve out a place for herself in the unforgiving world of organized crime, a world where women were seldom seen as equals to their male counterparts. But as powerful as she was, the very nature of the game she played left her exposed. And it was only a matter of time before her empire would be shattered by the weight of betrayal, law enforcement, and her own unraveling paranoia. By the late 1980s, Blanco's once thriving empire was beginning to show signs of cracking. The success of her cocaine operation, which had been built on smuggling vast quantities of cocaine into the United States, had made her a target on multiple fronts. As law enforcement became more focused on the ever-growing drug trade in the U.S., Blanco found herself in their crosshairs. The sheer volume of cocaine that was being funneled into the country made it impossible to remain undetected forever. Blanco had always been careful to cover her tracks, but her operation had become too large to hide. Authorities began to close in, collecting evidence and building their case against her, all while Blanco continued to believe she could outsmart them. Her ego, once a tool of empowerment, now became a liability that blinded her to the inevitable consequences of her actions. Her relationship with law enforcement had always been tense, but it had remained mostly non-confrontational for years. Blanco had managed to stay out of the authorities' radar, using a combination of bribes, intimidation, and meticulous planning to keep her operation running smoothly. She made sure her name never appeared in connection with any of the actual deliveries or distribution of cocaine. Her network was vast, extending all the way back to Colombia, where the Medellín cartel provided the cocaine, to the streets of Miami, where her loyal employees moved the product. For a long time, Blanco's ability to control all aspects of the trade, from manufacturing to distribution, allowed her to remain untouchable. But the more successful her operation became, the more it attracted attention. Even as Blanco strengthened her hold on the drug market, her grip on reality started to loosen. Blanco's paranoia began to creep into every part of her life. It wasn't just her competitors she feared, nor was it just the growing presence of law enforcement, it was everyone. The very people who had helped her rise to power, her family, her associates, and even her cartel partners, became potential threats. She had always ruled with an iron fist, but as time went on, she began to distrust even those closest to her. It was as if the very people who had helped her succeed were now her biggest liabilities, and the walls around her grew ever higher. Her need for total control began to take a toll on her relationships. The isolation she had once used as a tactic to maintain power now became a sign of weakness. Blanco's inability to trust anyone meant that she was slowly alienating herself from the very people who had helped her reach the pinnacle of the cocaine trade. In addition to her internal struggles, Blanco was now facing competition from rival drug lords. Her once dominant position in the cocaine trade was under threat, not just from law enforcement but from new players in the game. As the years passed and other cartels sought to expand their reach into Miami, Blanco found herself increasingly at odds with other criminals who had no respect for the territories she had built her empire on. They sought to undermine her, steal her network, and take control of the distribution routes she had fought so hard to establish. Blanco had always been ruthless, but now her enemies were equally determined, and she found herself unable to stop the encroachment. The combination of law enforcement pressure, rival cartels, and Blanco's own psychological decline made her a fragile figure, despite the immense power she had once wielded. Her empire, once a symbol of her unyielding strength and intelligence, now appeared to be crumbling before her eyes. The cracks in her operation were becoming harder to ignore. Her paranoia intensified, leading her to make rash decisions that alienated her most loyal followers. Blanco's ability to maintain control began to erode, and it wasn't long before her empire started to collapse in on itself. In 1985, Blanco was arrested, and the charges against her were nothing short of staggering. She was accused of being at the center of one of the largest cocaine smuggling operations in U.S. history. The federal government had spent years building a case against her, and Blanco's paranoia had ultimately led to her capture. It was a bittersweet moment for law enforcement. Blanco had once been untouchable, the queen of the Miami drug trade, and now she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. Her arrest marked the end of an era, and with it, the final chapter of the woman who had once controlled the cocaine empire with such precision. The trial that followed was a spectacle in itself. Blanco, once a feared and powerful figure in the criminal world, now stood before a judge, facing charges that would result in a lengthy prison sentence. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Her role in bringing tons of cocaine into the U.S. was well documented, and the brutal tactics she had employed to maintain control over her empire were widely known. Blanco's empire had been vast, and her criminal activities had been far-reaching. Yet as the trial unfolded, it became clear that the once feared queen of cocaine was no longer the powerful figure she had been in her prime. She was a criminal, caught in the web of her own ambition and paranoia. The very things that had propelled her to the top were the same things that had ultimately led to her downfall. In 1988, Blanco was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The sentence was a stark contrast to the life she had once lived, free to move across continents, building a drug empire that spanned countries and raked in millions of dollars. Now, she was behind bars, a shadow of her former self. Her time in prison was marked by both physical and mental decline. The woman who had once ruled the drug world with such precision and fear was now living in seclusion, cut off from the empire she had built. Her paranoia continued to haunt her, and her physical health deteriorated as she spent years behind bars. In the years following her conviction, Blanco's life remained steeped in controversy. While she served her time in prison, the world outside continued to evolve. The Medellin cartel, the organization she had once worked with, began to disintegrate after the deaths of its key figures, including Pablo Escobar. New players emerged, and the cocaine trade in Miami became a shadow of its former self. Blanco's story became a symbol of the rise and fall of the drug trade, a cautionary tale of how greed, paranoia, and ambition could lead even the most powerful figures to their demise. Blanco spent nearly 2 decades behind bars, a period that seemed to mark the end of the story for the woman who had once ruled the streets of Miami. But in 2004, after serving 19 years of her sentence, Blanco was released from prison. Her health was frail, and the world she returned to was a far cry from the empire she had once commanded. The cocaine trade had shifted, and Blanco's power had waned. She was no longer the feared queen of Miami. Instead, she found herself living in relative obscurity, removed from the criminal world she had once dominated. Blanco's release from prison did not lead to a resurgence of power or influence. She lived quietly in California for several years, far from the spotlight that had once been hers. But her past never left her, and her name continued to be associated with the violent, ruthless days of the cocaine boom. In 2012, Griselda Blanco was killed in a drive-by shooting in Medellin, Colombia, the city that had once been a key part of her drug empire. The circumstances of her death were fitting in a way, as they mirrored the violence and brutality that had defined her life. Blanco had lived by the sword and ultimately died by it. Her legacy remains one of the most infamous in the history of organized crime, a woman who rose from the depths of poverty to build an empire that spanned countries and who left behind a legacy that will never be forgotten. Griselda Blanco, the cocaine queen, may have fallen from grace, but her story will continue to captivate and horrify for years to come. The legacy of Griselda Blanco, often overshadowed by the larger-than-life figures who rose to prominence alongside her in the drug trade, is one that reflects both the brutal nature of the cocaine business and the relentless ambition of a woman who refused to be underestimated. From her rise as the queen of cocaine in Miami to her eventual arrest, trial, and imprisonment, Blanco's story is a complex tapestry of power, violence, and vulnerability, woven together by her unyielding pursuit of control over her empire. While she became one of the most feared and influential figures in the criminal underworld, her personal story is equally compelling. Behind the hard edge of the cocaine queen lay a woman whose path to power was fraught with pain, betrayal, and the weight of her own decisions. As her empire crumbled, so did the persona that had once struck fear into the hearts of her enemies, leaving behind a woman who could no longer escape the consequences of her past. By the time Blanco's downfall became inevitable, the world around her had changed. In the early years of her rise to power, Miami had been a hotbed of opportunity, a city with relatively few questions asked as long as the money kept flowing. It was a place where drug lords could operate without much scrutiny, where dirty money was laundered through nightclubs, and where criminal networks, both foreign and domestic, mingled freely. Blanco had recognized this early on, seeing Miami as a place where she could solidify her place in the drug trade. But as the cocaine market boomed, so did the attention it attracted. Law enforcement, which had once been distracted by smaller-scale crimes, began to focus more intently on the rapidly growing drug trade. Blanco's name, once whispered only in the shadows of Miami's underworld, was now known by those in the DEA and other federal agencies. The very success she had achieved now made her a primary target, and her vast operation, once a well-oiled machine, became a glaring symbol of the growing drug epidemic in the United States. The increasing attention from law enforcement had an immediate effect on Blanco's operations. While her initial approach had been to keep a low profile, her notoriety grew as the scale of her empire expanded. Blanco's paranoia, which had always been a driving force behind her actions, reached new heights. She began to see threats where there were none, and the fear that had once kept her enemies at bay began to backfire. Her attempts to maintain total control over her operation, keeping every part of the chain in her hands, became her greatest weakness. She couldn't trust anyone. As law enforcement closed in and rival cartels looked for an opportunity to take control of her distribution network, Blanco became a woman trapped by her own success. Her operation, once a model of efficiency and secrecy, began to unravel as Blanco alienated key figures in her network. The very people who had helped her reach the pinnacle of the cocaine trade were now becoming liabilities. It wasn't just the external forces, law enforcement, rival criminals, that were threatening to bring down Blanco. Her internal struggles, fueled by her increasing paranoia and distrust, were just as destructive. Blanco's need for control became all-consuming. She began to believe that everyone around her was conspiring against her, and this fear led her to make rash decisions. Her relationships with those she had once trusted began to sour. Her enforcers, who had once followed her every command without question, were now beginning to question her motives. Blanco had created an environment of fear and distrust, but it was starting to turn on her. The same methods that had helped her gain power were now the ones that were eroding it. She was no longer a queenpin surrounded by loyal soldiers, she was a woman who had isolated herself from those who could have helped her maintain her grip on the drug trade. One of the most significant consequences of Blanco's growing paranoia was her increasing reliance on violence to maintain control. She had always been ruthless, but now she became increasingly erratic in her approach. Blanco's use of violence to deal with perceived threats became more extreme. Her decision to eliminate anyone she suspected of betrayal, whether they were members of her own network or rivals from outside, was often swift and brutal. The fear she instilled in others, once a powerful tool, began to spiral out of control. She killed without hesitation, and her actions began to alienate even her most trusted allies. The very men and women who had helped her build her empire now feared her. The more Blanco tried to protect herself with violence, the more she pushed away the people who could have saved her from the collapse of her empire. Her inability to see beyond the immediate threat in front of her, her obsession with maintaining control, ultimately hastened her downfall. Blanco's increasing isolation had far-reaching consequences. As her paranoia intensified, so did the competition for power within the criminal world. Rival drug lords and cartels began to make their move, seeking to seize the lucrative distribution routes Blanco had once controlled. The Medellin cartel, with which she had forged an alliance early on, was no longer the monolithic power it once was. New players were emerging, and Blanco's empire, once so dominant, was now being chipped away piece by piece. Her cartel partners, seeing her vulnerability, began to distance themselves. Even as she struggled to maintain control, the world around her shifted. New competitors, like the Cali cartel, began to take over the routes she had established. Blanco, who had once been a key figure in the Medellin cartel, was now being replaced by younger, more ruthless figures. The criminals who once feared and respected her were now eager to take her down and claim the spoils of the cocaine trade for themselves. While Blanco's empire continued to collapse, law enforcement began to make significant strides in their investigation of her operation. The DEA, working in tandem with local authorities, had finally begun to piece together the full scope of Blanco's involvement in the drug trade. Blanco's network, once tight and secretive, was no longer able to operate in the shadows. Her name had become synonymous with cocaine in Miami, and her role in the growing drug epidemic could no longer be denied. Blanco's arrest, when it finally came in 1985, was the result of years of investigation and surveillance. Her capture marked the beginning of the end for the cocaine queen. The woman who had once ruled Miami's streets was now behind bars, facing charges that would eventually lead to her conviction. The trial of Griselda Blanco was a spectacle, a moment of reckoning for the woman who had once controlled one of the most powerful criminal empires in the world. Blanco's empire, which had once been untouchable, was now exposed for all to see. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and it was clear that Blanco's reign had come to an end. She was convicted on multiple charges, including drug trafficking, murder, and racketeering, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The sentence was a stark contrast to the power she had once held. Her days of ruling the cocaine trade were over. Blanco's conviction marked the end of an era in Miami's criminal history, and the world she had helped to build began to unravel completely. The years that followed were marked by Blanco's time in prison, where she struggled with both physical and mental decline. The woman who had once ruled the cocaine trade with an iron fist now faced the consequences of her actions. Her empire was gone, her allies had turned on her, and she was left to deal with the fallout of a life lived on the edge of violence, paranoia, and betrayal. Blanco's time in prison was a reminder that no empire, no matter how vast, is immune to collapse. Even the most powerful figures in the criminal world are ultimately vulnerable to the forces they create. Though Blanco was eventually released from prison in 2004, her return to the outside world was not the grand comeback she had once hoped for. She was no longer the feared queen of Miami. The cocaine empire she had built was gone, replaced by a far more fragmented and complicated drug trade. The world she had once ruled was now under the control of other, more powerful figures. Blanco, in the end, was a relic of a bygone era. Her story, while captivating, is also a cautionary tale, one of how ambition, paranoia, and violence can lead even the most powerful figures to their eventual downfall. Griselda Blanco had once been a force to be reckoned with, but in the end, the forces that had once made her invincible were the very ones that led to her destruction. As the years passed after her release from prison, Griselda Blanco's life became a quiet shadow of her former glory. Once the queen of Miami's cocaine empire, Blanco had built an empire that spanned continents, a network of drug routes, suppliers, and dealers that put her at the very heart of the global cocaine trade. Her life was once filled with the frenetic energy of deals, shipments, betrayals, and the constant hum of violence and danger. But after her arrest, trial, and eventual incarceration, the world she had once ruled had moved on without her, and so had the cocaine trade. Blanco, the woman who had once controlled the flow of cocaine into the United States, found herself in a new reality, no longer a powerful criminal mastermind, but an aging figure who no longer commanded respect, fear, or loyalty. Blanco's time behind bars, although marked by significant deterioration in her health, had not been enough to strip away the legacy she had created. She was still a living legend in the criminal world, a reminder of the cocaine boom that had defined the 1980s. Even in the years that followed her release, Blanco's name carried weight in certain circles. People still feared her, even though she was no longer in the position of power she once held. In the years after her release in 2004, Blanco lived a quieter life, away from the chaotic streets of Miami. Her health was failing, her body a result of years of living in the dangerous, violent world she had built. In California, where she lived out her final years, she was far from the attention and power she had once enjoyed. The noise of her past life had quieted, and she now lived in the shadows of the very empire she had once ruled with an iron fist. Despite the apparent calmness of her final years, Blanco was never truly free from the violence and paranoia that had defined much of her life. Even in her exile, her past continued to haunt her. Her health had deteriorated significantly, and she had become a frail woman, no longer the terrifying figure that once stood as the undisputed queen of the cocaine trade. However, her presence in the world of organized crime was still felt. Stories of her ruthlessness, her cunning, and her iron will persisted. Blanco was a ghost in the world of drugs and crime, a figure whose name was still whispered in certain circles, but whose reality was now distant from the heights she once reached. She was, in many ways, a relic, an artifact of a bygone era that was now fading from relevance. Yet even as she spent her days living in obscurity, Blanco's death would come to seal her legacy. On September 3, 2012, Griselda Blanco was gunned down in Medellin, Colombia. Her death, much like her life, was marked by violence. She had been living quietly in the city, far from the streets of Miami where she had once ruled with fear. The irony of her death was not lost on anyone familiar with her story. The woman who had built an empire on smuggling cocaine into the U.S., and who had ruthlessly eliminated anyone who posed a threat to her power, was now herself struck down in a fashion all too familiar to those who had crossed her in the past. It was a fitting, if tragic, end to a life that had been defined by bloodshed and betrayal. The circumstances of her murder were as mysterious as the woman herself. Blanco was killed in a drive-by shooting, a violent end that mirrored the chaos of her life. It was reported that two men on a motorcycle shot her outside of her home in Medellin. As with many figures in the criminal world, the details surrounding her death were murky, leaving room for speculation. Was her murder a result of a long-standing grudge, an act of revenge, or merely the unfortunate consequence of living a violent life? As with so much of Blanco's life, the truth was elusive, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and fear. Blanco's death served as the final punctuation mark on a story that had captivated the world for decades. She was, in many ways, a tragic figure, a woman who had risen from the depths of poverty to become one of the most powerful figures in the world of organized crime, only to lose it all in the end. Her story was not just one of power, but also of vulnerability, of a woman who, despite all of her strength and cunning, could never escape the consequences of the choices she had made. Blanco had ruled her world with an iron fist, but in the end, it was the very violence and ruthlessness she had employed to protect herself that led to her demise. Her death in Medellin did not immediately bring an end to her legacy. In the years that followed, Griselda Blanco continued to be a figure of fascination. Documentaries, books, and films would later be made about her life, painting a portrait of a woman who had been both feared and revered. Her story, in many ways, was a cautionary tale about the destructive nature of unchecked ambition and the consequences of living a life built on violence. Blanco's rise to power had been a testament to her resilience and cunning, but her downfall was a stark reminder that even the most powerful can fall. Her story, with all of its twists and turns, remained one of the most fascinating and tragic narratives in the history of organized crime. Blanco's legacy has also left an indelible mark on the cocaine trade. Though the world of drug smuggling has changed considerably since her heyday, the routes she helped establish continue to play a role in the trafficking of drugs between South America and the United States. In a broader sense, Blanco's story has come to symbolize the explosive growth of the drug trade in the 1980s and the rise of the cartels that would go on to dominate the global cocaine market. Her influence cannot be understated. She was a pioneer, albeit a ruthless one, in shaping the dynamics of the modern drug trade. While her personal empire crumbled, the infrastructure she helped put in place would continue to affect the flow of cocaine across the Americas for years to come. In the aftermath of Blanco's death, her legacy remains mixed. For some, she is a figure of empowerment, a woman who rose to power in a man's world, built an empire on her own terms, and commanded respect in an environment where women were rarely given the chance to do so. For others, she is a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition, a woman whose hunger for power ultimately led to her destruction. Blanco's story is one that raises important questions about power, loyalty, and the price of ambition. While she may have lived and died by the rules of the criminal world, her story transcends the boundaries of that world, resonating with anyone who has ever sought to rise above their circumstances, only to be undone by their own choices. Her death in 2012 brought an end to the chapter of the Cocaine Queen of Miami, but it did not erase the impact of her actions. Blanco's story continues to be one that captivates and fascinates, a testament to the violent and tragic world of the cocaine trade, and a reminder that power, no matter how great, is always fleeting. Even in death, she remains an icon of the criminal world, a woman who lived a life of both extraordinary triumph and harrowing defeat. The memory of Griselda Blanco, the woman who once ruled Miami with fear and calculated violence, will linger long after her death, serving as a reminder of the high price of ambition, power, and survival in the dangerous world she helped to create. Griselda Blanco's life was as much a product of her environment as it was a testament to her sheer determination to rise above it. Born in the slums of Colombia, Blanco's early years were marked by hardship and brutality, shaping her into the woman who would go on to rule one of the most lucrative and violent empires in the world. From the very beginning, she understood the brutal laws of survival. In a world where poverty and violence were constant companions, Blanco quickly learned that in order to survive, one had to be tougher than the next person, no matter who they were. This mindset, shaped by early encounters with violence, would become the bedrock upon which she built her criminal empire. Her story, from the poor streets of Colombia to the plush, dangerous neighborhoods of Miami, reveals a woman who was both a product and a master of her circumstances. Her entry into the world of crime wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Growing up in a neighborhood where violence was commonplace, Blanco's path toward the criminal underworld began in her teens. She was no stranger to street life, and by the time she reached her early 20s, Blanco was already involved in petty crimes, using her street smarts to make ends meet. But it didn't take long before she realized that there was more money, and more power, to be made from the larger-scale operations that ran in the shadows of society. Drugs, particularly cocaine, were becoming a hot commodity, and Blanco quickly recognized that the key to wealth lay in the ability to control the supply. She didn't just want a piece of the action, she wanted to control it all. Her entry into the cocaine trade wasn't marked by chance. Blanco wasn't merely a participant in the burgeoning drug world, she was a strategist, a woman who understood the intricacies of supply chains, the necessity of ruthless efficiency, and the power of fear. It was in the early 1970s that she first made her mark, working with the Medellin cartel in Colombia, a cartel that would come to dominate the international cocaine trade. Blanco's rise within this cartel was swift. Her ambition, intelligence, and lack of moral hesitation made her an ideal partner in the drug business. She quickly became known as one of the most efficient and ruthless figures in the Medellin cartel, using a combination of bribery, intimidation, and strategic planning to expand her empire. Her transition to Miami was a pivotal moment in her career. The city, at the time, was the epicenter of the drug trade in the United States, a perfect entry point for anyone looking to smuggle drugs into the country. Blanco knew that Miami's role as a crossroads for drug routes between Latin America and the United States made it an ideal base of operations. By the mid-1970s, Blanco was running a multi-million-dollar operation, smuggling tons of cocaine from Colombia into the U.S., using the city as her base of operations. She had the business acumen, the ruthlessness, and the strategic thinking to not just be involved in the trade but to control it. Blanco didn't just transport drugs, she organized the entire process, from sourcing the cocaine to distributing it in American cities, making her a key player in the global cocaine market. However, her empire wasn't built solely on business savvy. Blanco's reputation as a violent, calculating leader was essential to her success. She knew that in order to maintain control over her vast network of dealers, suppliers, and enforcers, she would have to instill fear. Blanco's methods of control were legendary. She ruled with an iron fist, and she wasn't afraid to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to her power. She used intimidation as a tool, orchestrating killings to ensure loyalty among her ranks. In the high-stakes world of the drug trade, where betrayal was common, Blanco's strategy of fear ensured that no one dared to challenge her authority. It wasn't enough to simply be feared, she made sure to be respected as well. Her tactics were brutal, but they worked. Blanco's empire flourished. Despite her violent nature, Blanco wasn't simply a woman of bloodshed. She was a master of strategy. She understood that in order to thrive in a business as volatile as the drug trade, one had to be adaptable. She forged alliances with powerful figures, including members of the Medellin cartel, leveraging their connections to expand her operations. Her ability to navigate complex relationships and maintain a loyal network was one of the key factors that helped her remain at the top. But Blanco's rise was also marked by the loyalty of her closest associates. She had a tight-knit group of loyal enforcers who helped her run the show, but even among them, her paranoia began to take root. Her growing paranoia became a turning point in her career. By the early 1980s, Blanco was no longer the same figure she had been in the early days of her empire. She had achieved unprecedented success, but she had also made powerful enemies, both within and outside of the criminal world. The walls she had built around her empire began to close in. Blanco's inability to trust anyone, combined with her fear of betrayal, led to a breakdown in the loyalty of her inner circle. She had created a world built on fear, and now that fear was beginning to fracture her empire. She saw enemies everywhere, and every person in her orbit became a potential threat. Even her closest allies began to distance themselves, fearing her unpredictable temperament and her willingness to eliminate anyone who crossed her. Her reign was also beginning to unravel for more practical reasons. Blanco's empire was based on smuggling, a business that was increasingly under the scrutiny of law enforcement. The DEA, FBI, and local authorities had finally turned their attention to the rising drug trade in Miami, and Blanco's network was now in their crosshairs. Blanco had always been careful, ensuring that her name stayed out of any direct dealings. But as her operation grew, so did the attention it attracted. Blanco's empire had become too large, too complex, and too visible for her to avoid the long arm of the law forever. The pressure of law enforcement investigations, combined with Blanco's deteriorating mental state, led to her eventual downfall. The cracks in her empire began to widen. Rival cartels began to encroach on her territory, and her increasing paranoia made it difficult for her to maintain alliances. As law enforcement and rival drug lords closed in on her empire, Blanco found herself more isolated and vulnerable than ever before. The very empire she had built began to fall apart under the weight of her actions. Her violent methods, which had once kept her at the top, now left her exposed and vulnerable. Blanco's legacy was starting to tarnish, and the world she had controlled was slipping away. Her eventual arrest in 1985 marked the end of an era. The woman who had once been untouchable, the queen of cocaine in Miami, was now facing charges that would bring her down for good. Blanco's arrest was the result of years of investigation, and her conviction was seen as a major victory in the fight against the drug trade. Yet Blanco's downfall was not a sudden event, it was the culmination of years of increasingly erratic decisions, betrayal, and law enforcement pressure. She had built her empire through sheer willpower and violence, but in the end, it was the same traits that had made her successful that led to her destruction. In prison, Blanco faced the consequences of her actions. She spent nearly 2 decades behind bars, a woman who had once been at the height of her power now reduced to a figure in a cage. Her health began to deteriorate during her time in prison, and her once formidable figure began to fade. Yet even in prison, Blanco remained a figure of intrigue. Her legacy continued to haunt the world of organized crime. Despite her fall from grace, she remained a symbol of the cocaine boom, a woman who had defied the odds and built an empire in a world that was unforgiving. After spending nearly 2 decades behind bars, Griselda Blanco's release in 2004 was a quiet affair. The media frenzy that had surrounded her rise to power had long since passed, and the cocaine empire she had once commanded was no longer the powerful force it had been in the 1980s. The world had changed. The streets of Miami, once the heart of the cocaine trade, were now governed by a different breed of criminals. The Medellin cartel, which had been her ally and business partner during the height of her power, had crumbled in the wake of Pablo Escobar's death. Blanco's return to society would not see a grand resurgence. Instead, she found herself a shadow of the ruthless queen-pin she had once been. Her time behind bars had left its mark. Blanco was no longer the fierce, charismatic leader who had built a global drug empire from the ground up. She was an aging woman, frail and somewhat forgotten, struggling to reconnect with a world that had long since moved on. But even though she was no longer a player in the drug trade, her name still held weight in certain circles. Blanco's reputation preceded her, and in the criminal world, people never truly forget a former queen-pin. Her life outside of prison was far removed from the opulent wealth and power she had once enjoyed, but it wasn't free from the shadows of her past. Blanco settled into a quiet life in California, far from the violent streets of Miami where she had once ruled. The years had taken their toll on her body, and she was not the same woman who had struck fear into the hearts of her enemies. Yet, despite her health issues, there was an undeniable magnetism that still clung to her, a quiet power, perhaps, or the remnants of the persona that had once made her a feared figure in the world of organized crime. Her days of managing drug shipments, of orchestrating deals and violence, were behind her, but Blanco never fully escaped the consequences of the choices she had made in her prime. Her quiet life in California was far removed from the chaos of her past, but it was still marked by the remnants of that past. Blanco was not a free woman in the truest sense. The fear, paranoia, and isolation that had defined her criminal career continued to haunt her. Though her name was no longer feared by the same people, there were still those who remembered the reign of the cocaine queen. Blanco had always lived under the shadow of her violent decisions, and now, in her older years, those shadows grew longer. The world she had helped create continued to spin without her, but her legacy was indelible. The death of her empire, as well as her personal decline, reflected the fragile nature of the criminal world she had once dominated. Her health began to deteriorate quickly after her release. Blanco had been in poor physical condition even before her arrest, but the years in prison had taken a toll on her. The woman who had once been able to command an empire through sheer force of will was now faced with the reality of aging. She was in and out of hospitals, struggling with the physical ailments that accompany growing older. But even as her body betrayed her, her mind remained sharp, as though the memories of her past life, her triumphs and tragedies, played out in her head in a never-ending loop. She was a woman who had lived a life that few could ever imagine, a life that had been both exhilarating and destructive. Yet, for all the physical decline she experienced, Blanco's legacy remained intact, casting a long shadow over the drug world she had once ruled. Though Blanco spent the last years of her life in relative obscurity, the fascination with her life never waned. Her story was one that captivated audiences, a tale of a woman who had defied the odds, built an empire, and then watched it crumble. Books, documentaries, and even films about her life continued to be produced, ensuring that her legacy would remain alive long after her death. Blanco was an icon in the world of organized crime, a figure whose rise and fall had been as dramatic as any fictional tale. Yet, for all the intrigue and fascination surrounding her, the real tragedy of Blanco's life was not just in her rise to power or her eventual fall from grace, it was in the human cost of her empire. For Blanco, the world she had created had been one of ruthlessness and violence. The drug trade was never a business for the faint of heart, and Blanco's success had come at a heavy price. Lives had been destroyed, families torn apart, and communities ravaged by the flood of cocaine that she had helped bring to the streets of Miami. In her pursuit of power, Blanco had left a wake of destruction that extended far beyond the criminal world. She had built her empire on fear and bloodshed, and in the end, it was those very same forces that would bring her down. She had trusted no one, eliminated anyone who crossed her, and let paranoia guide her every decision. Her life had been a series of violent confrontations, betrayals, and moments of brief glory before the inevitable collapse of everything she had worked to build. The final chapter of Blanco's life was written in Colombia, far from the streets of Miami where she had once reigned supreme. After years of living in relative peace, she was gunned down in a drive-by shooting on September 3, 2012, in Medellin, Colombia. Her death, though a tragic and violent end, seemed almost inevitable given the nature of her life. Blanco had lived by the sword, and she ultimately died by it. The circumstances surrounding her death were clouded in mystery, as with much of her life. Was her murder an act of revenge by those she had wronged during her rise to power? Was it a result of her past finally catching up with her? Or was it simply the dangerous nature of the world she had lived in that led to her untimely demise? Whatever the reason, Blanco's death was a reminder of the violence and unpredictability that had defined her entire existence. The woman who had once ruled Miami with an iron fist and built an empire on blood and cocaine had met a fitting end, violent and sudden. The legacy she left behind was one of fear, wealth, and bloodshed. Blanco's story had been one of a woman who had fought against the odds, but in the end, the very forces she had used to her advantage were the ones that destroyed her. Her name will forever be associated with the dark history of the cocaine trade, a reminder of how ambition, power, and ruthlessness can shape lives, and destroy them just as quickly. Blanco's story is often viewed as a tragic cautionary tale about the price of ambition and the cost of a life built on violence and crime. She had been a woman who had once commanded respect and fear, but in the end, her empire crumbled, and she was left alone in the shadows of her former self. The rise and fall of Griselda Blanco serves as a reminder that no matter how high one climbs, the fall is always inevitable, and often brutal. Her story is one of power, paranoia, betrayal, and loss, a story that continues to fascinate, intrigue, and shock those who hear it. Blanco may have left the world of organized crime, but her legacy remains forever etched in the annals of criminal history. The story of Griselda Blanco, once the most feared and revered woman in the world of cocaine trafficking, is not just about her criminal empire. It's also about the vast, dark undercurrent of change that swept through the world she had once conquered, and the intricate webs of betrayal, violence, and eventual erosion of power that accompanied her dramatic fall. Blanco, the woman who had turned the tide of the drug trade, building a sprawling network that stretched across countries, had found herself, in the end, a relic of the past, an icon of an era that was rapidly fading. Yet, her life story still held a magnetic pull, one that fascinated those who both admired and feared her. As time moved on, Blanco's narrative would evolve from one of ruthless crime boss to a tragic figure, whose eventual return to the shadows echoed the collapse of an empire she had once ruled. The end of Blanco's reign was not a single event. It wasn't just her arrest in 1985 or her eventual conviction that signified the collapse of her empire. It was the cumulative effect of time, law enforcement crackdowns, rival cartel encroachments, and Blanco's increasingly volatile personality that signaled the unraveling of everything she had worked so hard to build. In the early 1980s, Miami had been at the height of its cocaine boom. The streets buzzed with the movement of illegal money, and its residents were caught in a spiral of excess, fueled by drugs, money, and violence. Griselda Blanco was at the center of it all. Her cocaine empire wasn't just built on street-level sales but on a network that connected Miami to the heart of the Colombian cartels. She had managed to stay ahead of law enforcement and competitors alike, operating under a veil of secrecy and fear. But as the 1980s wore on, things began to shift. The cocaine trade was becoming harder to conceal, and the law enforcement agencies that had once ignored the swelling tide of drugs and money flooding into Miami now had their sights set on Blanco. The U.S. government, in collaboration with local authorities and international agencies, had intensified their efforts to bring down the Colombian cartels. Blanco, once invincible, now found herself under an ever-increasing microscope. The drug empire she had once built with finesse and secrecy was suddenly out in the open, and law enforcement had begun to piece together her intricate web of operations. The feds weren't the only ones closing in on Blanco. Rival cartels and drug lords, sensing her vulnerability, began to make their own moves to topple her. The Medellin cartel, which had once been her ally, was now turning against her. Her relationships with key figures in the cartel began to fray, and this loss of power within the cartel only hastened Blanco's eventual downfall. The sense of paranoia that had always haunted her was now becoming a crippling force. Blanco, who had once ruled with fear, began to turn her ruthless methods inward. She increasingly saw betrayal everywhere. Anyone who could potentially undermine her became a target for her wrath. She ordered killings, destroyed alliances, and, in doing so, she weakened the very structure that had supported her empire. Her reign, once unshakable, was now in freefall. Yet, Blanco's paranoia wasn't just a result of external pressure. The fear that had once made her a powerful and effective criminal mastermind had now become her undoing. Her empire had been built on a foundation of violence, loyalty through fear, and absolute control. As Blanco's paranoia intensified, she began to make reckless decisions, further alienating the people who had once worked for her. She didn't trust anyone, not even the loyal soldiers who had helped her build the empire in the first place. This created a rift between her and the very people who could have saved her. It wasn't just rivals or law enforcement she had to fear, it was the very people in her inner circle. The same fear that once made her untouchable now made her vulnerable. Her isolation increased, and her decision-making became erratic. She was no longer in control of the empire she had built, the empire was crumbling beneath her. The chaos that followed Blanco's internal strife was not just the result of external threats but of the decay of the operations she had once commanded with precision. The drug trade, at its core, relies on secrecy, trust, and the ability to move vast quantities of illicit goods without drawing attention. Blanco's failure to maintain control over her network, her inability to trust anyone, and her increasing violence toward those around her ensured that her empire, once smooth and efficient, became vulnerable to outside forces. Her empire began to unravel, and even her most trusted associates started to question their loyalty to her. As the law enforcement agencies closed in and Blanco's rivals took advantage of her weakened state, the walls around her empire began to collapse. Blanco's decline wasn't just marked by her empire's fall, it was also reflected in her personal life. Her family, which had once been a source of strength for her, was now a source of friction. Her sons, who had been raised in the lap of luxury afforded by her wealth and power, began to stray from the path Blanco had envisioned for them. Her relationships were strained, and the emotional toll of living a life surrounded by violence, betrayal, and constant danger began to take its toll. Blanco had always been a woman who prioritized her own survival above all else, but as the years passed, it became evident that even she could not escape the consequences of her actions. Her eventual arrest in 1985, while a blow to her empire, was only one chapter in Blanco's saga. The legal battle that followed was a spectacle, drawing attention from across the globe. The woman who had once ruled with fear was now fighting for her own freedom. In the end, Blanco was convicted of numerous charges, including drug trafficking, murder, and racketeering. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a far cry from the power and wealth she had once commanded. Her arrest and conviction were symbolic of the changing tides in the drug world. The very system that had allowed her to rise to the top now turned on her, and the public was left to watch as the cocaine queen of Miami was brought down. Yet, even behind bars, Blanco remained a figure of intrigue. Her time in prison was marked by isolation, physical decline, and a reflection on the empire she had once controlled. She had become a symbol of the drug trade's golden age, a woman who had defied the odds to build an empire, only to watch it crumble. During her time in prison, Blanco became more of a figurehead than a criminal mastermind. She was a relic of a bygone era, and the world outside her cell had moved on without her. Blanco's life in prison was a quiet one. The woman who had once been at the center of Miami's cocaine wars now spent her days in relative obscurity. Her health deteriorated, and the once formidable figure became frail. The years spent behind bars did little to restore the power she had lost, and Blanco became a shadow of the woman she once was. But even as her health declined, her legend remained. Documentaries, books, and films continued to be made about her life, and her story was now seen as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition and the cost of living a life built on violence and crime. Blanco's release from prison in 2004, at the age of 61, was met with little fanfare. The world had changed in the years since her conviction. Miami, once the heart of the cocaine trade, had evolved, and the once feared woman was now living out her twilight years in obscurity. But Blanco's death, in 2012, would bring an end to the saga of the cocaine queen. She was gunned down in a drive-by shooting in Medellin, Colombia, ironically, the place where she had once forged her alliances. The violent end to Blanco's life seemed fitting, a final chapter in the tumultuous journey of a woman who had lived by the sword and, in the end, died by it. Blanco's legacy is one of contradictions. She was a woman who had achieved great power and wealth but at the cost of countless lives and a legacy of violence. Her story is one of ambition, ruthlessness, and the high price of living a life of crime. Blanco's name will forever be associated with the dark underworld of the drug trade, and her legacy will continue to be debated. Was she a trailblazer who carved out a place for women in a male-dominated world? Or was she a cautionary tale, a woman whose unchecked ambition and thirst for power led to her inevitable downfall? Whatever the answer, Blanco's story is one that will continue to resonate with those who study the violent and often tragic history of the drug trade. Her life and legacy serve as a stark reminder of the fine line between power and destruction, and the dangers that come with living a life defined by violence. As the years passed since her release from prison, Griselda Blanco's life began to fade from the headlines, but the intrigue surrounding her remained undeniable. The woman who had once ruled Miami with unparalleled authority, the cocaine queen, who built an empire that spanned continents, now lived in the shadows of her past. The cocaine trade had transformed in the years following her incarceration, with new cartels rising to prominence and the methods of smuggling shifting. The landscape of the drug world was no longer as it had been in the 1980s, and Blanco, once the undisputed queen of the cocaine trade, was now a relic of a bygone era. Yet, even in her quiet exile, her name still carried weight. For those who had once feared her, her reputation loomed large, and even the younger generation of criminals could not escape the shadow of Blanco's legacy. Blanco's decision to relocate to California after her release from prison was a quiet one, away from the ever-watchful eyes of the media and the remnants of her former empire in Miami. She was no longer the powerful figure who once commanded loyalty through fear and ruthlessness. She was now an elderly woman in failing health, far from the glamorous life of wealth and control that had once been hers. The once feared queen-pin now lived in relative obscurity, removed from the hustle and bustle of the criminal world she had shaped. The years spent in prison had taken their toll, both physically and emotionally. Blanco, who had once been a woman of great power, now found herself grappling with the consequences of a life built on violence and manipulation. Despite the apparent calmness of her later years, Blanco's life continued to be haunted by the choices she had made. Her past, filled with bloodshed, deceit, and constant danger, was something she could not escape. It was clear that even in her quiet moments, the weight of her criminal career weighed heavily on her mind. Blanco was a woman who had once ruled through sheer will and ruthlessness, but the reality of her aging body and declining health now made her realize that she had left behind a legacy that was more destructive than she had ever imagined. The family she had tried to protect and the empire she had built were all in pieces. Her sons, who had once been the future of her empire, had moved on with their lives, some even distancing themselves from their mother's past. Blanco, who had once been able to bend the world to her will, now found herself isolated, her empire crumbled, and her health deteriorating. Even in her later years, Blanco never fully relinquished the paranoia that had always been a part of her. She had spent years surrounded by betrayal and enemies, and the fear that had once kept her on top now kept her hidden in the shadows. The woman who had once been fearless, the leader of a vast cocaine empire, was now a frail and broken figure. The loss of power and control was a bitter pill to swallow for Blanco, who had spent the majority of her life as a force to be reckoned with. Her health declined rapidly in her final years, and the once indomitable figure was reduced to a shadow of herself. She had lived a life that had been defined by excess, violence, and power, but now she was simply a woman in her twilight years, struggling to stay alive. Blanco's decline was not just physical. The emotional and psychological toll of her life in crime had left scars that were not easily healed. Her years in prison had forced her to confront the harsh realities of her past, but they had also left her with an overwhelming sense of loss. Her empire, once so vast and powerful, had crumbled in the face of law enforcement and betrayal. The violence she had employed to maintain control over her empire had left a trail of broken lives and broken relationships. Blanco had alienated many of the people who had been closest to her, and her own family had become fractured as a result of the choices she had made. Her sons, once the pride of her empire, had moved on with their lives, and Blanco's desire to maintain control over them, as she had done with her drug empire, had led to conflict and estrangement. Even in her final years, Blanco was haunted by the ghosts of the past, the lives she had ruined, the people she had betrayed, and the empire she had lost. Her health continued to decline, and in 2012, Griselda Blanco was finally taken by the very violence she had once wielded with such precision. On September 3, 2012, she was gunned down in a drive-by shooting in Medellin, Colombia. Her death, which seemed almost inevitable given the violent nature of her life, came as a shock to many. Blanco had spent her final years living in relative obscurity in Colombia, far from the streets of Miami where she had once ruled. The irony of her death was not lost on those who had followed her rise and fall. The woman who had built her empire on smuggling cocaine into the United States and orchestrating countless murders to maintain her power had now met a similar fate. The world had changed, and Blanco had been left behind, but her death marked the end of an era defined by the rise of the Medellin cartel and the cocaine trade that had once been her domain. Blanco's death was not just the end of her life, but the end of an era in the history of the drug trade. Her legacy, however, lived on. The cartels she had helped build and the drug routes she had established continued to play a role in the ongoing flow of cocaine between South America and the United States. Blanco had been a key player in shaping the dynamics of the modern drug trade, and her influence, though no longer direct, was still felt. The world of drug trafficking had evolved, and new figures had emerged to take her place, but Blanco's role in the rise of the cocaine trade could not be understated. She had been one of the first to understand the complexities of smuggling cocaine across international borders and distributing it to a global market. Her empire, though now defunct, had laid the groundwork for the powerful cartels that followed in her wake. In the years following Blanco's death, her legacy continued to be a subject of fascination. Documentaries, books, and films were made about her life, focusing on her rise to power, her ruthlessness, and the impact she had on the drug trade. Her story was one of triumph, of a woman who had risen from poverty to become one of the most powerful figures in the world of organized crime. But it was also a story of tragedy, of a woman whose ambition and ruthlessness ultimately led to her downfall. Blanco's story was a cautionary tale about the price of power, about the dangers of living a life built on violence and deceit. She had risen to the top through sheer will, but it was the very same traits that had propelled her forward that eventually brought her down. Blanco's life story is also a reflection of the larger story of the cocaine trade, which was at its height in the 1980s. The global drug market, driven by the demand for cocaine in the United States and other countries, had created a perfect storm of wealth, power, and violence. Figures like Blanco, along with her contemporaries in the Medellin cartel, had capitalized on this demand, building empires that spanned continents. Blanco had been a key architect of this world, and her life served as a symbol of both the allure and the danger of the drug trade. For years, she had been a queen in a world where power and violence ruled, but in the end, the very forces she had used to maintain control ultimately led to her undoing. Her story also serves as a reminder of the fleeting nature of power. Blanco's rise had been meteoric, but her fall was just as swift. She had lived in a world where power was everything, and she had used any means necessary to maintain her position at the top. But in the end, the very violence and betrayal that had helped her rise to the top were the same forces that destroyed her. Blanco had lived her life on her terms, but those terms had come with a heavy cost. Her empire may have crumbled, and her legacy may have been tarnished, but the impact of her actions on the world of organized crime and the cocaine trade would never be forgotten. Griselda Blanco had lived as a queen, and she had died as a tragic figure, a symbol of the high price of ambition, power, and survival in a world of crime. Griselda Blanco's name will forever be etched in the annals of criminal history, not merely as a drug trafficker, but as the architect of an era that saw the Colombian cocaine trade explode across the United States. Her story is not one of mere ambition, it is a tale of a woman who shaped the underworld through sheer grit, intelligence, and, above all, an ability to navigate the complex web of power, fear, and violence that came with controlling one of the world's most profitable illicit businesses. While many remember her for her ruthless rise to power and her eventual downfall, it is important to consider the broader context of her impact on the world she helped create, both in the criminal world and beyond. Blanco wasn't just a product of her environment, she was its creator, an agent of change who reshaped not only the drug trade but the very culture that arose around it. When Blanco entered the drug trade in the early 1970s, the landscape of Miami and the larger world of organized crime was ripe for a new player. The Medellin cartel, already powerful in Colombia, was beginning to extend its influence into the United States. Blanco, with her connections and streetwise intelligence, quickly established herself as a key player in the smuggling of cocaine from Colombia to the U.S. While others in the cartels were focused on more traditional avenues of operation, Blanco's vision and tactics were focused on building an intricate network that would take full advantage of the demand for cocaine in the American market. She was able to operate under the radar, using a blend of subterfuge and violence to stay a step ahead of both law enforcement and her competitors. What made Blanco particularly formidable was her ability to blend into the fabric of both the criminal world and the legitimate society she often operated in. While many criminals of her time kept to their respective territories, Blanco was willing to take risks, build relationships, and navigate various spheres of influence to grow her business. At the height of her empire, she was not only smuggling tons of cocaine but also controlling a complex network of suppliers, distributors, and enforcers who worked tirelessly to maintain the flow of drugs into the U.S. But Blanco's genius was in the details. She didn't just work with the Medellin cartel, she created her own networks, forging new routes and systems for smuggling, distributing, and laundering the enormous profits generated by her operations. Her understanding of logistics, human nature, and violence made her a force to be reckoned with. However, it was not just Blanco's intelligence and ruthlessness that made her such a potent figure in the drug trade. It was also her understanding of fear and power. She created a sense of invincibility around herself, a mythology that only grew as her empire expanded. In an industry dominated by men, Blanco became known as La Madrina, the godmother. She didn't just inspire fear, she commanded respect through her mastery of the world around her. In a business where loyalty was often bought with blood, Blanco ensured that anyone who crossed her was swiftly eliminated. This tactic of using violence and intimidation ensured that her empire ran like a well-oiled machine. Those who were close to her, whether they feared her or not, knew that betrayal was never an option. But even Blanco could not escape the complex web of forces at play in the world she had helped create. Her empire, though immensely powerful, was inherently unstable. The same fear that had kept her at the top began to undermine her as her paranoia grew. Blanco's downfall was not the result of one monumental mistake or a single rival cartel defeating her. It was the cumulative effect of her personality, her choices, and the shifting nature of the drug trade. Blanco, who had once been the mistress of control, found herself losing grip on the very empire she had constructed. Her increasing isolation and growing mistrust of those around her led to tensions within her ranks. Friends became enemies, and loyalties turned to betrayals as Blanco's empire crumbled from within. In the 1980s, as Blanco's empire began to falter, Miami itself was changing. The city, once a hotbed of illegal trade, had become a battleground for rival cartels. Law enforcement, which had long turned a blind eye to the drug trade, was now intensifying its efforts to take down the cartels that had turned the city into a war zone. The streets of Miami were plagued by violence, and it was here that Blanco's empire would meet its greatest challenge, the law. Law enforcement agencies, led by the DEA, were closing in on her, gathering evidence and building cases against her network. Blanco's paranoia intensified as she became increasingly aware of the tightening noose around her. The moment that marked the beginning of the end for Blanco was her arrest in 1985. This was not just the fall of one woman, it was the collapse of an empire. Blanco was convicted on charges of drug trafficking, conspiracy, and even murder. While many had expected her to walk free, her empire had already crumbled under the weight of internal and external pressures. The woman who had once been untouchable was now behind bars, her empire broken apart by the very forces she had helped create. In many ways, her arrest symbolized the end of an era in Miami's history, a time when the drug trade had been ruled by figures like Blanco, who built their empires on the backs of violence, fear, and manipulation. Blanco's time in prison was marked by reflection, isolation, and a loss of the very power that had once made her a queen in the world of organized crime. The years she spent behind bars were difficult. Though she remained a figure of intrigue in the world of crime, she had lost the fierce reputation that had once made her feared. The world she had built was no longer in her control, and the myth of the cocaine queen began to fade. The younger generation of criminals, who had once looked up to her as a trailblazer in the drug trade, now had their own ambitions, and they were no longer concerned with the legacy of the woman who had once been the queen of cocaine. Blanco was no longer in the game, she was simply another criminal, paying the price for her years of illicit success. Blanco's release in 2004 was uneventful. She had spent nearly 2 decades in prison, and by the time she was released, the world she had once dominated had changed. The drug trade, while still profitable, was now different. Cartels had evolved, and new players had risen to take control of the business. Blanco, now a frail woman, was no longer in a position of power. Her influence had waned, and the city that had once been her playground was no longer the same. Blanco was no longer a queen, but a figure of the past, living out her final years far from the violent streets of Miami. Despite her quiet life in California, Blanco's legacy was never far behind her. The world she had helped shape, the empire she had built, and the violence that had followed her remained in the memories of those who had been touched by her actions. Blanco's name was synonymous with the cocaine trade, and even though she was no longer an active player, the influence of her empire continued to reverberate through the criminal world. Blanco was a woman who had made history, not just through her criminal deeds, but through the cultural shifts she had influenced. The stories of her rise to power, her ruthless business practices, and her eventual downfall were told time and time again, ensuring that she would remain a part of the larger narrative of the drug trade. But it was not only in the world of crime that Blanco's legacy would live on. The impact of her story was far-reaching, touching not just those who lived in the shadows of the drug trade, but also the broader public, who were captivated by the myth of the woman who had become one of the most notorious figures in the history of organized crime. Documentaries, books, and films would continue to explore her life, and Blanco would remain an iconic figure, a symbol of the high price of ambition, power, and ruthlessness. In many ways, Blanco's life serves as a warning. It is a story of a woman who rose to the top of the drug trade by exploiting the systems of fear, violence, and manipulation, only to see it all fall apart as those same systems turned on her. Her empire was built on blood, and in the end, it was blood that brought it down. Griselda Blanco may have been one of the most powerful women in the history of organized crime, but her life also serves as a reminder that power, no matter how absolute, is fleeting. Her rise was meteoric, but her fall was inevitable. In the end, Blanco was a victim of the same forces she had used to climb to the top: paranoia, betrayal, and the violence that came with living in the world of organized crime. She may have been a queen, but in the end, she was brought down like so many others before her, consumed by the very empire she had built. Griselda Blanco, the woman who had shaped the cocaine trade in the 1970s and 1980s, was an anomaly in a world dominated by men. She not only broke the glass ceiling in the male-dominated criminal underworld, but she also created an empire that would rival some of the most powerful dynasties in history. In a society that believed women had no place in organized crime, Blanco proved them wrong, building a network that spanned continents, changed the dynamics of the drug trade, and left a legacy of fear and admiration that persists to this day. But as powerful as she was, Blanco's empire was ultimately brought down by the same traits that had allowed her to rise to the top: her ruthless ambition, her need for control, and her inability to trust anyone, not even those closest to her. Blanco's story begins in the slums of Colombia, where she grew up in a harsh environment that demanded survival above all else. Born into poverty and a life of crime, Blanco learned early that power was the key to survival. Her father was absent, and her mother was a street prostitute. Griselda was forced to fend for herself from a young age, selling stolen goods and committing petty crimes just to get by. But it was in these formative years that Blanco discovered her aptitude for manipulation and her ability to navigate the darker sides of the world. She was no stranger to violence, and it was in the underbelly of Colombian society that she honed her skills in coercion, intimidation, and control. But it was not just Blanco's criminal activity that marked her as a significant figure, it was her drive to take her life beyond the poverty that had defined her childhood. By the time she made her way to the United States in the early 1970s, Blanco had already begun to dream bigger. While many of her peers in the drug trade were focused on small-scale operations, Blanco's ambition pushed her toward greater goals. She understood the money and power that could come from controlling the cocaine trade, and she set out to do exactly that. She began by forming relationships with the Medellin cartel, one of the most powerful and influential drug organizations in the world. Through these connections, Blanco secured herself a foothold in the world of drug smuggling. She became the key figure in establishing cocaine trafficking routes between Colombia and the United States, with Miami becoming the primary entry point for the drugs. What made Blanco's operation particularly successful was her ability to create a system of operations that was both highly efficient and virtually invisible. Blanco did not just deal with one cartel or one set of contacts, she built a network of connections that spanned across multiple countries and sectors. Her operation was not just about smuggling drugs, it was about controlling the entire pipeline, from the fields of Colombia to the streets of Miami and beyond. Blanco understood the importance of securing routes, laundering money, and maintaining an air of secrecy. Her success was not simply a result of the drugs she moved, but of the complex, intricate system she had built to move them unnoticed. She wasn't just a drug dealer, she was a logistical genius, and her influence in the world of organized crime grew rapidly. Blanco's influence wasn't confined to the drug trade. She was also known for her violence that she used not only to protect her empire but also to assert dominance in a world where respect was hard-earned. Blanco was known for her cold, calculating approach to dealing with enemies. She had no qualms about murdering anyone who crossed her, and she used the fear she instilled in others to maintain control. Her enemies were many, rivals in the cartel world, law enforcement, and even former allies who had become liabilities. Blanco's ability to manipulate and eliminate those who stood in her way made her a powerful figure, one who was feared and respected in equal measure. Her reign of terror was not confined to the streets of Miami, but spanned the globe. Blanco's empire was fueled by not just the money from cocaine, but by the terror she inspired in those around her. As her empire grew, so did Blanco's paranoia. The power she had accumulated and the people she had betrayed along the way began to weigh heavily on her. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, unsure of who she could trust. Even those closest to her were viewed as potential threats, and her increasing distrust led to the dismantling of the very network she had worked so hard to build. Blanco's erratic behavior and her desire to control every aspect of her operation contributed to the eventual unraveling of her empire. By the time law enforcement finally caught up with her in the 1980s, Blanco's world was already in disarray. Her paranoia had caused her to push away allies and make enemies of former friends. She had gone from being a master of manipulation to a woman whose mistrust of others had become her own undoing. Blanco's arrest in 1985 was the turning point in her empire's decline. She had once been untouchable, but the law had finally caught up with her. She was convicted of drug trafficking, murder, and racketeering, and was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The empire that Blanco had spent years building came crashing down, and she was forced to confront the consequences of her actions. Her time in prison was marked by solitude, reflection, and the realization that she had lost everything. The cocaine empire that had once made her one of the most powerful women in the world was gone, and Blanco was left with nothing but the consequences of a life lived in the shadows. In the years that followed her conviction, Blanco's name became synonymous with the rise and fall of the Colombian cocaine trade. She was no longer the woman who had ruled Miami, she was a symbol of the dangers of ambition and the high price of power. Yet, even behind bars, Blanco's reputation continued to grow. Her story was one of triumph, betrayal, and ultimate destruction, a narrative that was as much about the fragility of power as it was about the brutality required to maintain it. Blanco had once been at the top of her game, but in the end, her empire had crumbled under the weight of her own paranoia and mistrust. By the time Blanco was released from prison in 2004, she was a different woman. She was older, frilier, and no longer the formidable criminal mastermind who had once ruled the cocaine trade. But even in her later years, Blanco's presence was still felt. She had become a figure of intrigue in the criminal world, a reminder of a bygone era when cocaine empires were built on bloodshed and fear. Blanco spent her final years in relative obscurity, far from the spotlight she had once reveled in. The world had moved on without her, but the legacy of her rise and fall remained. Her death, in 2012, came as no surprise to those who had followed her life. Blanco, who had once been a queen of the cocaine trade, was gunned down in a drive-by shooting in Medellin, Colombia. The same violence that had propelled her to power had now come full circle, claiming her life in the very country where she had built her empire. Blanco's death was the end of an era, a final chapter in the story of a woman who had lived her life on her own terms, but had paid the ultimate price for it. Blanco's legacy is one of contradictions. She was a woman who defied the odds to become one of the most powerful figures in the drug trade, but in the end, she was undone by the very same traits that had helped her rise to the top. Her empire was built on violence, manipulation, and ruthlessness, and it was those very qualities that led to its downfall. Blanco's rise and fall serve as a reminder of the fragility of power, and the dangers of living a life defined by ambition and violence. Her story will continue to be told, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a symbol of the price one pays for living a life in the shadows. Griselda Blanco's story, one of the most compelling and tragic narratives in the history of organized crime, illustrates the complexity of ambition, power, and eventual downfall. Her rise from a troubled, violent youth in Colombia to the heights of drug trafficking domination in the United States was not just a matter of opportunity, it was a meticulously crafted plan to not only survive but to thrive in a world that often overlooked women in criminal enterprises. Yet, in Blanco's case, her gender became both an asset and a liability. Her intelligence, resilience, and ruthlessness were the hallmarks of her success, but it was the very nature of her success, tied to violence, betrayal, and control, that made her empire impossible to sustain in the long term. Blanco didn't just alter the drug trade, she redefined it. But the cost of that power would eventually become her undoing. In the early stages of Blanco's involvement with the Medellin cartel, she was already proving to be a formidable force. In Colombia, where the cartel's network was expanding, she recognized the enormous potential of cocaine in the United States. Miami became the key battleground for Blanco's operations. While the drug trade had always existed, Blanco's approach was different. She didn't just smuggle drugs into the country, she built a sophisticated operation that included everything from smuggling routes, enforcers, and logistics to the money laundering infrastructure that allowed her to funnel the enormous profits back into her operations. At the height of her empire, Blanco's cocaine distribution network stretched from Colombia to Miami, and then throughout the United States, filling the streets with the addictive substance that would fuel a generation's drug habits. Blanco's empire was not built on a single relationship or a few trusted associates. Her success came from the breadth and complexity of her connections, spanning a network of suppliers, distributors, and enforcers across multiple countries. It wasn't just the drugs that Blanco managed, it was the very system that allowed cocaine to flow through the United States like an unstoppable river. She built and controlled her own supply chain, ensuring that every part of the operation ran smoothly, from the moment the cocaine left Colombia to the moment it was distributed in the U.S. It was this logistical genius that set her apart from other figures in the drug trade, who were often limited by their dependence on existing cartel structures. Blanco's ability to orchestrate an entire international operation made her one of the most powerful drug traffickers in history.